The scent of stale coffee and cheap perfume is the cologne of my trade. It's a smell that clings to the fibers of my wool blazers, that seeps into the worn leather of my briefcase, a constant, pungent reminder of the low-grade dread that hums perpetually in the background of a courthouse. That Tuesday morning was no different. I was running on the dregs of 3 hours of sleep and the bitter, overbrewed coffee from the pot in the firm's kitchen, my mind a whirring engine of case law and procedural strategy. I was already late, my heels clicking a frantic, staccato rhythm on the worn marble floor of the county courthouse, a sound that usually filled me with a sense of sharp, unassailable purpose. Today, it just felt like the frantic ticking of a clock, counting down to another hollow victory. The case file was a dead weight under my arm. A pro bono assignment, a last-minute dump onto my already buckling desk by a senior partner who viewed anything that didn't bill at $500 an hour as a charitable nuisance. White-collar fraud, Eleanor, he'd said, not even looking up from the Financial Times spread across his vast, mahogany desk. Some small-time investment advisor. Davies. Embezzlement. Looks like a straightforward plea. Shouldn't take more than an hour of your time. Just hold his hand until he accepts the inevitable. I remember the internal eye roll, the familiar curl of cynicism in my gut. A straightforward plea. As if anything involving human greed and the American legal system was ever straightforward. It was always a messy, complicated, soul-draining business. But this was my lot. The price of my partnership track was to quietly handle the dregs no one else wanted, the cases that were beneath their notice but were, for the people involved, their entire world crashing down. I pushed open the heavy, ornate oak door of courtroom 4B, the familiar scene washing over me like a wave of déjà vu. The solemn, dark-paneled walls, the elevated bench that looked like a throne of judgment, the flag standing stiff and silent in the corners. My eyes, trained by a decade of this work, automatically scanned and categorized the players. The prosecution team, two young, eager ADAs looking smug and well-rested, their suits crisp, their postures radiating the easy confidence of those who held all the cards. A handful of spectators scattered on the hard wooden benches, their faces a mosaic of boredom and morbid curiosity. And my new client, sitting alone at the defense table, his back to me, shoulders slumped in that universal, defeated posture of guilt. I walked towards him, my mind already rehearsing the standard, detached introductory spiel I used for all new clients. Good morning, Mr. Davies. I'm Eleanor Vance, from Sterling and Croft. I'll be representing you today. I've reviewed the initial filing, and while the evidence appears substantial, our first step is to discuss your options. I need you to be completely honest with me about the facts of the case. The words were a well-worn record, played so many times they had lost all meaning. They were a shield, a way to maintain professional distance from the human wreckage I was paid to manage. I reached the defense table, the scent of old wood and lemon-scented polish filling my nostrils. I pulled out the heavy, wooden chair beside him, the loud, grating scrape of it against the floor echoing in the hushed formality of the room. He turned. And the universe, my carefully ordered, meticulously constructed universe, simply folded in on itself. It was Ben. My Ben. My husband. The man who had kissed me goodbye just 2 hours ago in our sun-drenched kitchen, his lips soft and warm against my forehead, his voice still rough with sleep. Don't work too hard, Ellie, he'd murmured, his hand a familiar, comforting weight on the small of my back. The man who made me a perfect cup of French press coffee every single morning for the past 12 years, who knew I took it with a splash of cream and no sugar. The man whose heartbeat was the steady, reliable rhythm I fell asleep to each night, the sound that quieted the constant, churning anxiety of my own mind. His face was a ghastly, bloodless mask of pure, unadulterated terror. His eyes, those familiar, crinkly-eyed, laughing eyes I loved more than any sight in the world, were wide with a panic so profound it seemed to be consuming him from the inside out. Ellie, he whispered, and my name on his lips was not a greeting, not an endearment, but a desperate, strangled plea, a confession, a death knell. The thick, manila file folder I was holding slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers. It hit the polished floor with a sound like a gunshot, exploding in a chaotic cascade of stark white paper, black-typed accusations, and grainy photocopied evidence. I didn't move. I couldn't. My lungs refused to draw breath. The air in the room had turned to solid lead. I was distantly aware of the judge, an elderly man named Judge Morrison, peering down over the rims of his spectacles, his brow furrowed. I saw the two ADAs turn from their conversation, their expressions shifting from boredom to keen interest. The bailiff, a large man with a kind face, took a half-step forward, his hand resting on his belt. But they were all phantoms, blurred figures moving through water. The only thing in sharp, horrifying, hyper-real focus was my husband's face. Benjamin Davies. The Defendant. Case number 73492. The people of the state of New York versus Benjamin Davies. My mind didn't just race, it shattered. 1,000 jagged shards of memory and realization flew at me, each one a fresh cut. The late nights at the office. The sudden, unexplained weekend business trips to Philadelphia. The new, expensive watch that had appeared on his wrist last Christmas. A great deal on a vintage piece, he'd said. The vague, excited talk over the past year of a big project, a sure-thing investment with a friend from college that was finally going to pay off, that would allow us to buy the lake house we'd always dreamed of. I had been so buried in my own mountainous caseload, so proud of my own sacrifices and long hours, so utterly convinced of the solidity of the life we had built together, that I hadn't seen the hairline fractures spiderwebbing across its surface. I, Eleanor Vance, a lawyer paid a small fortune to dissect lies and uncover hidden truths, had been living in a house of cards, blind to the fact that the foundation was made of sand. A coldness, so absolute it felt like my soul was freezing solid, spread from the core of my being out to my fingertips. My profession, my identity, the very thing that defined me and had given me a sense of power and control in a chaotic world, had become a brutal, inescapable trap. My sworn duty was to defend him. My ethical obligation was to provide him with a zealous defense, to be his champion in this arena. But my heart, my betrayed, shattered heart, was screaming a primal, wounded denial. The two halves of my soul were being wrenched apart, right there, in the cold, impartial, and brutally public light of a courtroom. I have always been a hunter of truth. It's more than a profession, it's a pathology, a deep-seated compulsion born from a childhood spent navigating the shifting, unstable landscape of my father's lies. My father was a charismatic man, a salesman by trade and a fabulist by nature. He could weave a story so vivid, so full of colorful detail and heartfelt emotion, that you would swear you could smell the ocean breeze or feel the sun on your face from his description. The problem was, his stories were beautiful, intricate castles built on air. The failed business ventures were always the result of a partner's treachery or a sudden, unforeseeable market collapse. The missed mortgage payments were due to a computer error at the bank or a check that was surely lost in the mail. The promises, the heartbreaking, soul-crushing promises, of a family vacation to the Grand Canyon, a pony for my birthday, a new, stable home in a better neighborhood, were like gorgeous, iridescent soap bubbles. For a moment, they would shimmer with impossible beauty, and then they would pop, leaving behind nothing but a faint, sticky residue of disappointment. My mother lived in a perpetual state of hopeful suspension. She was a woman who chose the beautiful lie over the ugly truth every single time. Her eyes would shine with faith as she listened to his latest scheme, her entire posture softening with relief. "Your father has a plan," she would tell me, her voice full of a desperate conviction. "He's going to make it all right." I learned, at a very young age, to be the silent, watchful skeptic. I learned to study the small tells, the way his eyes would dart to the left when he was inventing a detail, the slight sheen of sweat on his upper lip when the story became too elaborate, the way his hands would fiddle with his car keys, a nervous, metallic percussion to his symphonies of falsehood. I became a tiny, hyper-vigilant detective in my own home, collecting evidence of his deceptions, building a case against my own father in the quiet courtroom of my mind. The day he left, when I was 14, there was no dramatic confrontation, no tearful goodbye. I came home from school one day to find his closet empty, his shaving kit gone from the bathroom sink, and his beat-up Oldsmobile missing from the driveway. There was no note. No forwarding address. Just a void where a father was supposed to be, and a week later, a bounced child support check that my mother tearfully tried to hide from me. She didn't collapse in a single, dramatic moment, it was a slow, quiet crumbling, like a sandcastle succumbing to the tide. The light in her eyes didn't go out, it just dimmed, replaced by a permanent, weary confusion. I remember holding her one evening as she cried, her body feeling small and brittle in my arms, and I made a vow to myself, a silent, ferocious oath that I carved into my bones. I would never be fooled again. I would never be that vulnerable. I would never, ever build my life on a foundation of sand. I would devote myself to the truth, no matter how ugly, no matter how painful it was to face. I would learn the rules, I would master the system that could, on its best days, force the truth out into the open where it could be examined and dealt with. I would become a lawyer. I would become a wall against which the lies of the world would shatter. Law school was a brutal, exhilarating baptism by fire. I was surrounded by kids from Ivy League families, legacies who saw the law as a natural stepping stone to a life of comfort and influence. I saw it as a weapon, a shield, a tool for survival. While they networked at cocktail parties, I was buried in the library, my highlighter running dry as I devoured torts and contracts, criminal procedure and evidence. The Socratic method, which terrified so many of my peers, felt like a familiar game to me. I was already fluent in the language of cross-examination. I had been practicing it at the dinner table my whole life. I graduated first in my class, a fact that surprised my professors and enraged my more privileged classmates. My mother framed my diploma and hung it in a place of honor in our small living room, right where a portrait of our family had once hung. It was her trophy, her proof that her daughter had not only survived the chaos but had conquered it. I took a job at Sterling and Croft, a venerable, notoriously cutthroat corporate firm. It wasn't the public interest work I'd sometimes dreamed of in a fleeting, idealistic moment, but the starting salary was a siren song after a childhood defined by financial insecurity and bounced checks. I told myself it was a temporary move. I would do my time, pay off my staggering student loans, build a nest egg, and then, once I was secure, I would make the move to the public defender's office or a legal aid society. I would use my skills for good. But the years slipped by, one blending into the next. The money was deeply seductive. The wins, even for corporate clients I knew were morally bankrupt, became a powerful addiction. The thrill of outmaneuvering an opponent, of finding the one loophole in a contract, of securing a victory for a client who deserved to lose, was a dark, heady rush. I was scarily good at it. I learned to be ruthless, to bury my empathy, to find the microscopic flaw in a witness's testimony and exploit it without mercy. The idealistic young woman who wanted to champion truth and justice was slowly, inexorably, being buried under a mountain of billable hours, partnership politics, and hollow, expensive victories. The only place that young woman still existed, the only place where the walls came down, was at home, with Ben. I met Ben at a chaotic, independent coffee shop near my first apartment. I was frantically prepping for a high-stakes deposition, my table a disaster zone of sprawling files, empty coffee cups, and highlighted legal pads. He was at the next table, completely absorbed in a sketchbook, a faint line of concentration between his brows. In a moment of clumsy distraction, he reached for his latte and knocked the entire cup over, a tidal wave of milky brown liquid cascading across my table, swamping my carefully organized documents. I shot up, a torrent of legalistic fury ready to erupt, to eviscerate this careless stranger with the cold precision I usually reserved for incompetent expert witnesses. But he looked up, and the apology died on my lips. He had the kindest eyes I had ever seen, the color of warm honey, and they were filled with such genuine, flustered horror that my anger instantly evaporated. "I am so sorry," he stammered, grabbing a wad of napkins and starting to mop frantically at the soggy mess. "I am such a klutz. Please, let me buy you another coffee." "And whatever these were," he said, gesturing helplessly at my ruined papers. He was an architect. He built things, he told me later, over the replacement coffee he insisted on buying. Real, tangible, beautiful things that would stand for 100 years. He saw poetry in structure, integrity in a well-supported beam, art in the way light fell through a strategically placed window. He spoke about load-bearing walls and foundational integrity with a reverence that was almost spiritual. He was the absolute antithesis of my father. My father dealt in air, in promises, in stories. Ben dealt in concrete, in steel, in blueprints, in things that were measurable, testable, real. He was quiet, steady, solid. He was the bedrock I had spent my whole life searching for. Our courtship was a slow, gentle revelation. He was patient with my skittishness, my tendency to look for the hidden angle, the ulterior motive. He never gave me a reason to doubt him. His stories were simple, verifiable. He was who he appeared to be. Our wedding was a small, simple affair in my mother's backyard, under a canopy of twinkling lights. We wrote our own vows. Mine were full of grand, sweeping pronouncements about honor, fidelity, and building a life together on a foundation of unwavering trust. His were quieter, simpler, but they sank deeper into my soul. He promised to always make me coffee in the morning, to be my safe harbor from the storms of the world, to build a home with me that was stronger than anything life could throw at us. He slipped a simple, flawless platinum band on my finger. It felt more than like a piece of jewelry, it felt like an anchor, a tether to something solid and true. For the first time in my life, I felt I could finally stand down. I could finally stop searching for the lies, because with him, I believed, with every fiber of my being, there were none. Or so I had thought, with a faith so complete it was its own form of blindness. Standing in that courtroom, the cold, hard edge of the defense table digging into my thighs, the scattered pages of his indictment lying at my feet like fallen leaves, I realized the foundation was not just cracked. It had been a deliberate, carefully constructed illusion. The bedrock was quicksand, and I was sinking, the cold, thick truth filling my mouth, my lungs, drowning me. The judge's voice boomed, pulling me back from the precipice. "Ms. Vance? The court has been waiting. Are you prepared to proceed?" I looked at Ben. A single, traitorous tear had escaped his eye and was tracing a slow, clean path through the stubble on his cheek. He looked like a little boy, lost and terrified. The man I loved. The man who had shared my bed, my secrets, my life. The man who had systematically, deliberately, lied to me, who had potentially broken the law in a significant way, who had dragged our name, my hard-won professional reputation, through the mud. My professional duty was crystalline, spelled out in the rules of professional conduct I could practically recite in my sleep. I was his attorney of record. I had a fiduciary duty to provide him with a zealous defense within the bounds of the law. I had to advise him on his Fifth Amendment rights, to strategize, to fight for him, to use every tool at my disposal to secure the best possible outcome, regardless of my personal feelings. The ethical mandate was unambiguous. But my heart, my shattered, betrayed heart, was screaming a different, more primal truth. How could I defend him? How could I stand before a judge and a jury and make arguments, so reasonable doubt, fight for the freedom of the man who had looked me in the eye every single day for weeks, for months, maybe for a year, and lied? How could I use my hard-won skills, the very skills I had honed to protect people from men like my father, to protect my husband, who had willingly become one of them? "Ms. Vance?" Judge Morrison repeated, his impatience beginning to show. "We have a full docket this morning." I opened my mouth, but no sound emerged. My throat had closed shut. I was a lawyer, a wordsmith, rendered utterly mute. A wife whose husband had just become a stranger. A woman whose entire understanding of her reality had been proven, in an instant, to be a carefully constructed fiction. I had to move. I had to do something. I bent down, my movement slow and jerky, as if I were moving through syrup, and began to gather the scattered pages from the floor. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely pick them up. Each page felt like a live wire, shocking me with its contents. The people of the state of New York versus Benjamin Davies. Count 1, wire fraud. Count 2, securities fraud. Count 3, conspiracy to commit fraud. The words swam before my eyes, the legalese blurring into a single, damning accusation: liar. Thief. Stranger. I finally managed to stand, clutching the crumpled, disordered papers to my chest like a shield. I turned to face the bench, my voice a hollow, strained thing I barely recognized as my own. "Your Honor," I croaked. "A moment. I beg the court's indulgence. I require a brief recess to consult with my client." The judge sighed, the long-suffering sigh of a man who has presided over every conceivable human drama and found most of them tedious. 5 minutes, counselor. In the consultation room. Bailiff? I didn't look at Ben. I couldn't. I simply turned and walked, my legs feeling like they were made of wood, towards the small, windowless room off the side of the courtroom. I heard his footsteps behind me, hesitant and shuffling, the footsteps of a condemned man. The bailiff opened the door for us and closed it firmly behind us, the solid thud of the latch engaging sounding like the ceiling of a tomb. The room was cold and smelled strongly of disinfectant and despair. It was furnished with only a cheap, scarred laminate table and 2 mismatched plastic chairs. I stood with my back to him, my arms wrapped tightly around myself, as if I could physically hold my breaking self together. I stared at a deep scuff mark on the beige wall, focusing on it with an intensity that made my eyes water. The silence was a physical presence, thick and suffocating. "Ellie," he began, his voice cracking on the second syllable. "Don't," I whispered, the word sharp and brittle. "Don't you dare say my name. Please, you have to let me explain." I whirled around then, the fury and pain finally breaking through the numbing shock. "Explain? Explain what, Ben? How you, Benjamin Davies, a licensed architect who designs buildings meant to stand for a century, somehow became the co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar investment fraud? Explain the late nights? The business trips to Philadelphia? Explain the Patek Philippe watch on your wrist that you said you got for a steal? Explain how you sat across from me at dinner last night, talking about maybe getting a dog, while knowing you were going to walk into a courtroom this morning and be formally charged with multiple felonies? Explain how you could let me walk in here, your own wife, completely blind, completely unprepared, to find out like this? My voice was rising, shaking with a rage that felt like it would incinerate me. The words were tumbling out now, a torrent of anguish and betrayal. I am a lawyer, Ben. My entire job is to see through lies. I cross-examine people for a living. I tear apart testimonies. I find the inconsistencies, the hidden motives. And I couldn't see the lie that was living in my own house, sleeping in my own bed. You made a fool of me. He flinched as if I'd struck him across the face. He gripped the back of one of the plastic chairs, his knuckles turning bone white. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he said, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. It was just a small thing at first. A friend from college, Mark, he approached me. He had this idea, this tech startup, an app for sustainable architecture. It was a can't-miss opportunity. I wanted to give you more. You work so hard, you're under so much pressure at that firm. I see what it does to you. I wanted to be the one to provide, to take that weight off your shoulders. I wanted to be your hero. I wanted to give you the lake house, the financial freedom to leave Sterling and Croft and do the work you always wanted to do. His words were a chilling echo of my father's. I was doing it for you. For the family. It was all for us. The same old, poisonous refrain. So you lied? You committed fraud? For me? The sarcasm in my voice was acid. I didn't think of it as fraud. Not at first. It was just creative accounting. The projections were just a little optimistic. We needed to attract more investors to get the project off the ground. It was just a temporary bridge, Ellie, I swear to God. We were going to pay everyone back, with interest. The startup was going to be huge. But then the beta testing failed, the investors got spooked, and everything, it all just fell apart. The house of cards just collapsed. He was still lying to himself, minimizing, using soft, euphemistic language. Creative accounting. A little optimistic. A temporary bridge. I could hear the ghost of my father in every weasel word. The horrifying symmetry of it was almost beautiful. I had spent my entire life running from my father's shadow, only to marry a man who had not only walked into it but had built a condo complex there. What did you do, Ben? My voice was dangerously quiet now, all the fire gone, replaced by a glacial calm. Specifically. Tell me exactly what you are accused of. No more stories. No more creative accounting. The truth. The whole, unvarnished, ugly truth. He crumpled then, the last vestiges of his defenses disintegrating. He sank into one of the flimsy plastic chairs, his head falling into his hands. And he told me. He told me everything. He told me about creating false financial statements that inflated the startup's assets and user base. He told me about using his reputation and our stable, professional life as a married couple to lend an air of legitimacy to the venture, to reassure wary investors. He told me about the Ponzi scheme nature of it, about funneling money from newer investors to pay off the earlier ones, creating the illusion of profitability. He told me about the emails he'd sent, the wire transfers he'd authorized, the presentations he'd given to rooms full of people, looking them in the eye and selling them a dream he knew was built on a lie. Mark was the mastermind, the salesman, but Ben was the respectable front, the solid citizen, the architect who made the whole operation seem above board. He was a willing, active, knowing participant. With every damning detail, another piece of my heart didn't just break, it turned to dust. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This wasn't a single, desperate mistake. This was a calculated, sustained, months-long deception. A second life, lived in the shadows of our own. When he finally finished, the room was silent again, but now it was filled with the heavy, suffocating weight of the unvarnished truth. There were no more stories left to tell. I finally looked at him, really looked, seeing him not as my husband, but as a client who had just confessed his guilt to me in excruciating detail. The man I loved was gone. The shared history, the inside jokes, the quiet mornings, the planned future, it all felt like a dream I'd had about someone else. My God, I breathed, the words barely audible. Ellie, you have to help me, he pleaded, his eyes wild with a fresh wave of terror, now that the full truth was out. You're the best lawyer I know. You're brilliant. You can find a way out of this. You have to. You're my wife. And there it was. The ultimate, unbearable collision. My devotion to him, my wifely duty, screamed at me to protect him, to circle the wagons, to use every trick, every loophole, every ounce of my cunning and skill to save him from the consequences of his actions. But my devotion to justice, to the truth, to the very core of who I was and why I had entered this profession in the first place, recoiled in utter horror. To defend him zealously now, knowing what I knew, would be to become an active accomplice to his lie. It would be to stand in a courtroom and perpetuate a fraud upon the court, upon the victims, and most of all, upon myself. It would be the final, complete, and total betrayal of the little girl who had vowed to never be fooled again. I thought of my mother, her spirit broken by my father's endless stream of lies. I thought of the investors, the retired couples, the young families, the small business owners, who had trusted Ben, who had given him their money based on his representations, people who had potentially lost their life savings. I thought of the idealistic young woman I had once been, who believed the law was a sacred instrument for good, a scalpel to cut away falsehood and expose the raw nerve of truth. I couldn't do it. I straightened my shoulders, the gesture feeling foreign and painfully stiff, as if I were wearing a suit of armor that was 2 sizes too small. The coldness that had taken root in my chest spread, hardening into a resolve as solid and unyielding as granite. No, Ben, I said, my voice eerily, terrifyingly calm. I can't. His head snapped up. What? What do you mean? You're my wife. You have to. I am also an officer of this court, I said, the words of the oath I had taken years ago ringing with a newfound, terrible clarity in my ears. And I will not use my license, the license I worked for my entire life, to defend a fraud that I know to be true. I will not stand up in that courtroom and lie for you. I will not be a party to this. The shock on his face was absolute, almost comical in its disbelief. He had truly, genuinely believed I would. He had counted on it. That realization was the deepest, most profound cut of all. He hadn't just betrayed my trust, he had taken it for granted. You're abandoning me?" he whispered, his voice thick with a bewildered terror, as if I were pushing him off a cliff. "I am recusing myself from your case," I stated, the clean, clinical legal term a sharp blade that severed our professional connection. "I will inform the judge immediately. I will arrange for another attorney from the firm to take over. They will likely advise you to take a plea deal. It is your best, and only, realistic option. You are guilty, Ben. You need to face that. You need to accept responsibility." I turned and walked to the door. I could not look at him for another second. The love was still there, a bleeding, wounded animal in the cage of my ribs, but it was now intertwined with a disgust and a disappointment so profound it made me feel physically ill. "Ellie, please," he cried out, his voice rising to a desperate pitch. "I'm your husband. We vowed. For better or for worse." I paused, my hand on the cold, metal doorknob. I thought of our wedding vows, spoken under the twinkling lights. For better, for worse. In sickness and in health. But there was an unspoken vow, one that underpinned all the others, more sacred than any words spoken in a ceremony. The vow of honesty. The vow of shared truth. He had shattered that one, and in doing so, he had rendered all the others null and void. Without turning around, I spoke, my voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the stifling air of the small room. I know he heard it. I know he felt the finality of it in his bones. You stopped being my husband the moment you decided to lie to me. I walked out of the consultation room and back into the courtroom. The air felt different. Thinner, sharper, charged with a new and terrible energy. I moved to the defense table, my movements precise and automatic, like a robot executing its programming. I picked up my briefcase, the familiar weight of it feeling alien in my hand. I could feel the eyes of the entire room on me, the judge, the prosecutors, the spectators, the court reporter. They were all watching, wondering what seismic shift had just occurred behind that closed door. I approached the bench, my posture ramrod straight. "Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying to the far corners of the silent room. "Eleanor Vance, for the record." Due to an irreconcilable personal conflict that has just come to my attention, I must formally and immediately recuse myself from representing the defendant, Mr. Benjamin Davies. I move for a brief continuance so that new counsel can be secured. Judge Morrison stared at me, his bushy eyebrows raised high on his forehead. He was a smart man. He could read the devastation on my face, the rigid control in my posture. He knew something catastrophic had happened. But the law, in its cold, procedural wisdom, had a box for this. Motion granted, he said after a long, weighty pause. Court is adjourned until 1 o'clock this afternoon. Ms. Vance, the court thanks you for your professionalism. Professionalism. The word was a bitter pill. I had just broken my own heart, but I had followed the rules. I didn't look back at Ben. I didn't look at anyone. I turned and walked out of the courtroom, through the long, echoing marble halls, and out through the giant brass doors into the blinding, indifferent light of the day. I stood on the courthouse steps, the city traffic swirling around me, the sounds of horns and sirens and chatter a meaningless roar. I felt utterly, completely, and absolutely alone. The platinum band on my finger felt like a brand, a searing reminder of a promise that was now ash. I reached down and slowly, painfully, twisted it off. It came away easily, too easily. I held it in the palm of my hand, the metal still warm from my skin, a tiny, perfect, empty circle that had once contained my entire world. I didn't throw it away. I closed my fist around it, the edges digging into my palm, and I put it in the pocket of my blazer. A reminder. Not of him, not of the love we'd lost, but of the day I was forced to choose between my vow to a man and my vow to myself. And I had chosen myself. The months that followed were a special, refined kind of hell. Ben, as I knew he would, took a plea deal. He was sentenced to 36 months in a minimum security federal prison. I filed for divorce. The process was cold, bloodless, the legal dissolution of a partnership that had already ceased to exist in any meaningful way. I moved out of the beautiful, airy home he had designed for us, a home that now felt like a beautifully decorated tomb, and into a small, sterile, anonymous apartment with beige walls and rented furniture. I threw myself into my work, but now with a radically different purpose. I gave my notice at Sterling and Croft. The corner office, the partnership track, the obscene bonuses, it all felt like dirty money, tainted by the same world of deceit Ben had embraced. I took a significant pay cut and a job with the City Legal Aid Society. My new office was a cramped, windowless cubicle. My clients were people facing eviction, victims of wage theft, immigrants fighting deportation. The work was emotionally draining, the wins were harder fought and often bittersweet, and the resources were perpetually stretched thin. But every time I stood up in housing court or an immigration hearing now, I felt clean. I felt like I was using my power, my voice, my hard-won skills, for something that mattered. I was honoring that fierce, 14-year-old girl who had vowed to chase the truth, no matter the personal cost. I was, finally, building a life on a foundation I could believe in. It's been 3 years now. The sharp, searing, all-consuming pain has dulled into a permanent, low-grade ache, a scar tissue that has become part of my emotional landscape. I heard through the legal grapevine that Ben was released early for good behavior. I don't know where he is, what he's doing, or if he's rebuilt his life. I don't try to find out. That chapter is closed. Sometimes, on a quiet Sunday evening, I take the platinum band out of the small wooden box at the back of my dresser drawer. I hold it in my hand, and I allow myself to remember the good times, the man I thought he was, the future we had planned. And I feel a profound, bottomless sadness for the life we lost, for the love that was real, even if the man wasn't who I believed him to be. But I never, for a single second, regret the choice I made in that cold, airless consultation room. I learned the hardest lesson of my life in the most brutal way possible. The law can be twisted. Vows can be broken. Love can be betrayed. But the one thing you must never, ever sacrifice is your own integrity. Your devotion to justice must start with justice for yourself. You cannot build a life on a lie, no matter how beautiful it seems, no matter how much you want to believe it. You have to be willing to walk away, even from the person you love most in the world, if staying means betraying the very core of who you are. That day in court, I didn't just lose a husband. I found myself. And I would rather stand alone, in the harsh, clear, unforgiving light of the truth, than be forever lost in the comforting, beautiful, and utterly devastating shadows of a lie.